So we're going to revisit again for 2025, rent versus buy, round three, 2025 edition.
And not only are we talking about rent versus buy, but I'm going to be asking the question, why not both?
Of
But
course,
we'll
you
get to
had to
that
be
later
the
on.
indecisive one.
I'm different,
We're
okay?
I am so different.
we're going to look at the changing housing landscape and how recent economic factors have impacted both buying and renting.
We'll chat about the true cost of home ownership and the reality of renting and try to answer the question, are you just throwing money away on rent?
There's also a handful of personal considerations like overall life stability, career plans, mobility, relationship status, location, financial stability, and more.
So, with rentership on the rise, coupled with more purpose built rentals being built than ever before, but at the same time, 1 in 4 Canadians planning to invest in real estate in the next 5 years, we have a bit of a confusing picture here, Dan. So, let's start at the beginning.
Is buying real estate even the right thing to do? The easiest way to do that is to look at buying your primary residence, I would say, versus renting your primary residence.
And you're right, Dan. This is actually probably one of the most highly debated topics in the real estate world, not just here in Canada, which is trying to understand which is the right fit for you.
It really depends on how good you are at investing in other things than real estate. Standard investing advice would tell you that you have to save a percentage of your income and then invest that in appreciating assets that compound on a year over year basis. For most Canadians, given the breadth of our economy, the lack of options in our economy, buying real estate has historically been one of the best ways that you're able to do this. Compounding is the repeated addition of interest payments to the principal invested over a period of time. The principal grows exponentially as each new payment of interest is added to it. The higher the number of compounding periods or the longer that you own the asset, the greater the amount of compounded interest you'll receive.
When if you're thinking about trying to think of an example for that compound, you think about that like penny doubling every day type of thing, right? The power,
Yeah.
that's the power of compounding. Now, most common investing advice, which of course we do not give on this show, not financial advice, but most common investing advice recommends this pretty simple tactic: save money and invest that money into assets. Home ownership effectively forces Canadians to follow this principle, essentially, whether they like it or not, or whether they even know that they are doing it or not. Every month that goes by, when you are paying your mortgage, you're putting money into an asset that will hopefully grow in value over time.
Yeah, and I think that, historically, Canadians haven't been exceptionally good at saving money compared to other countries. I'll pull up a chart here for those watching on YouTube in a second. But the other advantage of real estate investing through your primary residence is that it's tax advantaged, right? Like where else can you get massive appreciation with leverage and you also don't pay tax on the gains? So earnings from capital gains appreciation on your primary residence in Canada are not subject to the capital gains tax, at least not right now.
Yeah,
They're
there is an
exempt.
ongoing, I guess, capital gains saga right now, but yes, as of now.
Yeah, and so that means any money you earn from the appreciation on your primary residence, you would not have to pay income tax on. This is much different than other places. In the U.S., it's capped at I think 500,000 for a couple. I think it's 250 per person. And other countries where it's fully taxable. But it's also led us kind of down this dark path where we've really commoditized housing, and Canadians are now financially incentivized to take on leverage and try and buy the biggest and most expensive primary residence they can in order to maximize that tax-free capital gains investment exemption.
Yeah, I guess hence all of the McMansions that we've seen. And Dan, this goes back and raises the question of another age-old real estate question: whether or not your home is, by all technical standards, an investment or a liability.
And the truth, probably from my perspective, would fall somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think there's kind of two ways that you can look at this. The first way is the liability. Okay, now for all those people that haven't ever read or heard this book, I encourage you to go check it out. But this is a real estate show, and this is like one of the early books that I think everyone reads, and that is Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad, Poor Dad. So, according to the things and principles taught in this book from Kiyosaki's perspective, On a monthly basis, you have to make a mortgage payment. It is technically a liability because it's debt that needs to be paid. You're not actually making money living in your primary residence.
But Canadians seem to look at it in a bit of a different way. And that'll give me kind of the second way of looking at it. They look at that cost, the interest payment, as, let's call it, a cost of doing business, or a
Hmm.
cost of investing. And that their house is a savings vehicle, or something that protects you from an opportunity cost. And that opportunity cost would be renting, right? So even though you have to pay some interest, if I think most people do the logic in their head. They think, if I'm paying less interest than I would be paying in rent, and it's forcing me to save money, and it's potentially going up in value, then it's that savings vehicle plus a couple of other things: the speculative, the tax advantage, etc. So
Hmm.
your home can either generate rental income from tenants, or save you the rent you'd otherwise pay to a landlord, right? So it kind of pays you rent in both ways. Looking at the Canadian household savings rate over time, we've seen a steady decline. Like many Canadians, I personally am not particularly skilled at saving or investing money. So, if you remember the story that I told earlier, one of the reasons buying a primary residence was so compelling to me was because I'm one of those people who isn't exceptionally good at saving money or investing either. So, real estate had been a great wealth building tool for me during that phase of my life. Something like 70% of Canadian household net worth is tied up in the primary residence. And I think that's a testament to the fact that many Canadians are using real estate as a wealth building tool. Not just real estate as a wealth building tool, but their homes as a wealth building tool.
Yeah, I love that. And it does make a lot of sense. I think it's really about what way you look at this, and it is a very subjective thing for everybody. And Dan, this has both benefits and disadvantages for the Canadian economy as a whole. One of the biggest disadvantages is that it takes a lot of capital that could otherwise be productive in the economy, right? And it takes that capital out of the economy and puts it into people's primary residence and people's households. And we know that the Canadian economy loves real estate, and might be a little too much of a love story.
Yeah, it's interesting. Um, the chart, or sorry, the stat that I referenced about the percentage of household net worth being tied up in a primary residence. I just Googled it because I wanted to find what my source was on that, because it was just something that we had in notes for a while. But it comes from this RBC report called Canadian renters face higher hurdles to accumulating wealth than homeowners. And this is a really interesting set of data. So it shows that soaring home equity accounts for the majority of boosted net worth. And then it shows a chart that says Canadian homeowners' net worth is 4 times higher than renters. The distribution of worth per household as of, this is 2023, so it's probably come down quite a bit since then, but still substantial. Like it's not just like it came down and now it's even. Like, it came down and maybe now it's 3x, not 4x.
Hmm. Yeah.
And it shows that lower earning renters are being squeezed to a greater extent. So this is one of those really important things to understand about inflation, right? Inflation, it basically is it's a distribution of wealth from the middle class to the upper class. And the lower class doesn't, or like, your less wealthy people, poor people, let's call it, um, they don't feel inflation really, because they're hand to mouth, right? They get money and they spend it. So they never really notice that the impact of inflation. Rich people benefit from inflation because they own assets, and assets continue to hold their value against the currency that's being having its buying power diminish. The middle class is what gets inflated away in the
Mm.
period of inflation, and this is why holding assets can historically be an important thing, and also be seen as an inflation hedge. And that's what RBC really captured in this report.
Yeah,
Now,
fascinating.
yeah. Now, a big piece of this is what percentage of our GDP comes from all of the activity that I just described, the homeowners, et cetera, and that's residential investment. Residential investment is basically real estate commissions and home renovations. But for individuals, having a lot of wealth tied up in their primary residence can be a good thing due to its low liquidity or how difficult it is to cash out of a home. It all forces you to keep holding the asset. You can't just go onto your stock portfolio and dump it on Quest Trade or whatever.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because you're feeling
Yeah.
emotional that day. Like it's a long
I
process. If
don't
you're
like this
feeling,
house anymore.
yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
If it's gone down 10%, you can't like rush out a bit out of the asset, and you can't rush into it really either. It's a hard thing to buy and sell. So real estate makes it easier for people to stay invested in assets than other investments.
Yeah, I think that low liquidity piece is really important, right? I mean, compared to stocks, bonds, crypto, gold, whatever it may be, very different than I guess as you said, Dan, trying to sell that house, within a couple hours or a couple days or whatever. I mean, the fastest way to really get money out of a property that you have equity in would be going and try to get it in a refinance or something like that, and that still takes time. So when it comes to investing, you'll often hear people make the statement that it's time in the market much better than trying to time the market. You might have heard us say that once or twice in the show. And when it comes to real estate, this is especially true. Holding a real estate asset over the course of a mortgage term or a mortgage amortization schedule is one reason that it's been such a great wealth building tool, because you incrementally own more and more. And that's why, Dan, we always say that, if you're looking at getting involved in real estate investing, you got to be doing it for hold that asset for at least 5 years traditionally, right? Unless it's a flip or something like that.
Yeah, I think the nice part about real estate as well is that as you progress through the amortization, you're paying less interest and more principal. So
100%. Yeah.
it's like one of the few things that has increasing returns to scale where, as you own it, it actually pays itself off faster, or you pay it off faster. Let's say if your mortgage payment stays the same, but you're paying proportionally less interest and proportionally more principal. Now, add to that, if you're buying an investment property, and this is the big thing for investment property, if somebody's paying the same rent and your mortgage payment pays the same, in year one they might be paying you $10,000 of principal and $10,000 of interest, but in year 5 or 6 they could be paying you $20,000 of or like $15,000 of principal and $5,000 of your interest. And so the longer that you own the asset, providing you don't keep extending the amortization on the renewals, the faster it pays itself off, the more efficient it becomes at its job of yielding
Yes.
for you.
I love that. Yes.
So let's focus a little bit on the buy side, because we want to kind of unpack the costs of doing this. We mentioned, that the switching costs or the difficulty in buying and selling assets is one of the advantages, but it can also be one of the disadvantages, right? So start by asking yourself these questions about your situation. Are you prepared for the upkeep, potential renovations, emergency work and expenses, and unforeseen things associated with owning a property? Is homeownership important to you at a qualitative level? If you're buying as a couple, is your relationship solid enough? This one gets a lot of people. Is your professional situation stable?
And you got to think even a bit further ahead than that. And you got to ask yourself all those questions right now. But again, look at that things in that 5 year mark. I always get people to do this. What's the 1 year and what's the 5 year? And the 5 year is important for when you're looking at real estate, because you got to ask yourself things like, do you want to have children? Do you plan on having children in that space? Do you plan on having to move to another city for work, or maybe just moving for pleasure, or even to another country? Is that something that could happen? And if that did happen, what would you be doing with that property? And do you plan to stay in the same job long term? And maybe that's location based or whatever it may be. But these are all the questions that you need to ask yourself before you buy. But let's just assume you are buying, because you did, Dan. You shoved it in my face that you are a homeowner right at the beginning of this episode. So thank you for
Hey,
that.
you wrote this script.
So why don't you tell me a little bit about some of the main benefits that owning a home can include? And then I'm going to go and single-handedly shut them all down and tell you why it's not so good.
Cool. So some of the main benefits would be obviously building equity through your mortgage payments, which means that with each payment, you own more of your home outright, unlike renting where monthly payments don't contribute to ownership. Real estate tends to appreciate over time, making it a solid long-term investment where you hold, if you hold the property for a long time, and it could be, is the property actually going up in value, or is the buying power of a dollar just going down? Probably
Hmm.
the more likely one. Having security of knowing that you can't be evicted when your property is sold. Although, to be fair, in like most landlord and tenant systems, it's actually easier for a lender to kick you out than a
Yeah.
than and to be fair, like I think in most jurisdictions as well, if you have a lease, you can't actually be evicted when the property is sold. So um,
So
anyway,
that one's a little bit of an iffy one then, let's say.
yeah, security of tenure I think is like it is an interesting one. Financial security, obviously through predictable fixed rate mortgage payments over a 5-year term that decreases over time as you pay down the principal, unlike rent, which typically increases year after year. So your shelter costs would kind of go up, even though we are kind of seeing fluctuations in both right now where rates went up. So mortgage people lost for the last little bit, and then rents are now coming down. And then home ownership gives you the freedom of, making the space your own a little bit more than renting. You own it, so you can renovate or decorate or, change flooring, kitchen, etc.
I know that was your main thing, right? You're just like, I just need to decorate, and that's
Big
probably,
decorating guy
yeah,
for sure.
that's why you
Yeah, I
bought.
just
So,
wanted to paint some walls pink.
so okay, listen, those are all valid points. But from the renter's perspective, home ownership isn't all sunshine and roses. Let's look at some of the key downsides that may make you think twice about buying. First thing is it's a big commitment. You can't just sell your house overnight or break your mortgage at a whim, right? With at least without not likely facing some kind of hefty penalty. We already talked about the lack of liquidity. Buying a home is, and the going back to investment versus liability, right? Buying a home is only really profitable in most cases if you plan on sticking around or adding value to it. Then you've got your ongoing maintenance costs. Dan, when renting, your landlord handles all the upkeep, from things like mowing the lawn to the leaky basement. But as a homeowner, you are responsible for all of the repairs and all of the maintenance. So whether it's replacing a roof every decade or dealing with that exploding toilet at 3 a.m., you're the one dealing with it. You're the one paying the bill. Also, mortgages, right? Mortgages are usually, by and large, higher than rent. It's usually cheaper to rent than to pay for a mortgage. Of course, this now heavily is subjective on your situation, the price of your house, the terms and conditions and rate of your mortgage, and your overall location. Um, Let's also say that in some cases, ROI, your return on investment, can be slow. It can take time for the value of your home to increase depending on what kind of economic cycle we're in, and depending on your location, depending on what kind of asset class you bought. So don't expect immediate return. And then, of course, here's a big one: there's less disposable income. Homeowners take on a considerable responsibility, and usually, in a lot of cases, a ton of debt, which may prevent them from investing elsewhere, slow you down in your retirement planning or the college funds for the kids. In some cases, homeowners find themselves house poor, which just means a big part of their income goes towards the cost of home ownership, leaving little left over to pay for other stuff you need or just even other stuff you want.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that last one because I think most people look at, the home, like that people see people who own homes as wealthy, or, let's say a country with higher home ownership would be a country or have wealthier citizens. So let's look at like Switzerland versus Russia, right?
Yeah, I mean, when I think Switzerland, I think wealth.
And then when you think about Russia,
I mean, not wealth, or at least is not as wealthy as a Switzerland, right?
right? Or yeah, you mean there's many different examples here you could use, but 68% of people in Switzerland rent, and only 31% own property.
Wow. Okay, a little unexpected. What does that compare to on the Russian side of things?
In Russia, only 11% rent and 87% of people own. And this seems to be more and more of a thing, especially it's funny because like, whenever we get into this discussion, when I talk about like how the future of capitalist countries is high rentership, people are like, you're a
Renters
commie.
economy. Yeah.
And it's like, you're a
Yeah.
commie. And I'm like, okay, let's do this. I'm like, sure. Let's just say that I'm a commie because a couple of people have left us wonderful reviews saying that I'm a commie. Let's
Please
let's
stop
say
doing that,
okay,
by the way.
yeah. um, let's look at there's only it shouldn't be hard. Let's look at the countries in the world that are communist, that identify as communist governments. There's only five. It's not that hard. They are China, Laos, Cuba, North Korea. Is it Russia? I can't remember the last one. I think it's Russia.
I don't
Anyway,
know. Yeah.
all of them, they have the highest home ownership rate. Now let's go to the list of the top five home ownership rates in the world. It's the same list of countries. China's home ownership rate is like 99% or something. I mean, on the list that you have in front of me here, we have China at 83%, Russia at 87%. So more and more of these like socialist or communist countries um, tend to have a high home ownership rate, and so it seems like there's a correlation between it tracks from my perspective. Like the most capitalist thing you could do is literally take a basic human right and turn it into a financial instrument, right? So like the rentership piece makes sense to me, but I think it's funny because a lot of people associate what do you call it, like property rights, freedom to own property, as like this like tenure of and I think people conflate like communism with like or capitalism with democratic countries. um, Although I think Canada is like indicated that socialist democracies can kind of exist, not for better or worse. Obviously, it's not a political statement, but for the experimentation of this whole thought, if you're doing it because you want freedom from the state, right? Like, which a lot of people have discovered libertarianism now because of Javier Milei. Um, I want you to think about it this way. Like a lot of people think owning property is like this, oh, the state can't take it from me. It's like the state invented that property. Like that they drew the lines. Okay. Number one. Number two is because you own it, if you don't pay your income tax, they now can lien you. They can take your property away from you. So you actually buying in, you're giving them a commitment that you're going to pay your taxes now. You're also committing to pay property tax to another state, which is your municipality, and land transfer tax to your province in most jurisdictions in Canada. And so I would actually argue, if we're getting into the communism versus capitalism thing, that
I didn't think we
um,
were, but here we are.
yeah, well, I mean, look, people are pretty into politics these days. So I'm just, as a thought experiment, it's almost like owning property is actually more of a investment in the idea of a state, and more of a, surface area exposure to the state by saying, hey, look, I own this thing within your jurisdiction. So you could, you have some recourse against me if I don't follow your rules. Than renting, which makes you like super mobile. You know what I mean? You don't have to pay, if you don't pay your income tax. By the way, not financial advice, please pay your taxes. But if you don't, they can't lien you, right? Like, what are they, they can go after your bank account or whatever. But if you're like a crypto person or working in the cash economy or whatever, they don't have that. You don't have to pay an annual property tax just for the right of your property existing, as an example. And so it's like the question, or like the whole thought around that this has confused me for a long time. Anyway, I'll end my rant there because I know that's definitely pretty far off script, but it's just fascinated me that
No, and listen, it's backed up in the data, right? Again, let's look at this. Russia, 11% renters, 87% homeowners, and then if you look at a Germany, for instance, 64% renters, 35% homeowners. And Germany is the main country keeping things together in the EU. So I think this goes
well,
back
so
to the
just yeah, sorry. The last piece on that is that maybe if people would say that like these communist or socialist countries maybe are more authoritarian, perhaps those countries know that homeownership is like, maybe human beings have this like fundamental desire to own property. It's like it's like a human nature. It's an animal nature, right? We want to own, like all other creatures want their own little shelter, right? Beavers make their little huts. Dogs go around peeing on stuff. Like maybe humans are the same, and the governments actually you know realize that it's an easy way to exercise control on people is to give them that dream of their own little cave, right? And
yeah. I mean, I think it's definitely been ingrained into social and popular culture that and as far back as history goes, right? People just want their own place. I completely agree.
for sure.
So I think the question remains then: if you don't buy a home with all the money you saved, what are you going to do with that money? Right? Let's look at some of the high rentership. Well, those are highly productive economies. So if you're not doing what do you if you're not spending all that money that you've saved or accumulated, or that gift from mom and dad or family or inheritance or whatever it may be, if you're not spending that on a down payment, what are you doing with that money? And is it throwing it away? Well, are you investing or starting a business like all the Swiss and German renters out there? I think that's the key difference, is what is being done with the money. And if the answer is nothing or not much, then yeah, I'd say that maybe rent is throwing money away.
But you can't really say that as a renter, right?
Well, actually, I can, Dan, because I do both. I rent my primary residence because it's got a great location, it's a cool spot, it serves all my needs. But I also own businesses and real estate and rental properties. So the money I saved on not putting a down payment on my own house was used on down payments on rental properties and investing in businesses, all which make me money.
Wow. You have to be the smartest guy I've ever met. Did you
Thank
come
you
up with that
for
on your own?
Thank you for sticking to the script on that one. Yes, why? Thank you. I did come up with it all by myself. Never have. No one's ever done this before. Nick Hill
Brand
original.
new idea.
So
Just write a
let's
book on it.
let's
Rich house,
talk
poor
about.
house.
So let's talk about renting, Dan. Let's talk about some